All right, one of the most common questions I get as a minister, both from Christians and non-Christians, is about slavery and why the Bible um, has slavery in it. Why it seems to condone slavery because it doesn't say anything expressly against slavery. So I want to give a quick answer to that. I want to make it quick, if possible. I just want to give you four sorts of answers. It's true, by the way, the Bible talks about slavery. It makes reference to slavery. There's household codes throughout the New Testament that Paul gives primarily, which talk about wives and husbands, slaves and masters, and children and parents. So there's a fair amount about slaves, and Paul writes to slaves. The book of Philemon is about a slave named Onesimus. The whole book is. So it's certainly in the Bible, and I understand the objection. But let me give you four things to think about when it comes to this idea of slavery. Number one, and maybe most importantly, it's not that kind of slavery. It's not that kind of slavery. What I mean is, it's not the kind of slavery that you're thinking of, or that we often think of as the most recent historical type of slavery, which was bound up inherently with ethnicity and race. It simply wasn't that kind of slavery. That's the kind of slavery we think about, understandably so, that brutal, depraved slave trade that is so shocking for us to believe that Christians took part in and didn't stand up against sooner. There is no question of the moral degradation of the slavery that we think about most recently, historically, of the African slave trade and all that it became here in America as well. And it's sickening to think about and read about, and astonishing that Christians were part of that, and that they had such a major blind spot in their way of thinking. But this kind of slavery in the Bible is not that kind of slavery. It has nothing to do with ethnicity or race or color or any of those things. In the ancient world, it just wasn't like that. Anyone could be a slave in the ancient world. All you had to do was lose in a battle or have a great debt that you couldn't pay. So literally, you could be a nobleman 1 minute on a steed, riding a steed into battle with a great sword and a high class, and the next minute be a slave at the bottom of the social totem pole because you lost the battle. It didn't matter about ethnicity or color or any of those things. It didn't matter about the value of you as a human. It just meant that you lost or that you were in great debt. And that could happen instantly to anybody. Slavery was basically, N.T. Wright points out, slavery was basically the way things got done in the first century. It was the ancient world's version of electricity and gasoline. It was really the workforce. Slavery was the workforce in the first century. It was the hundreds of thousands of working people. You feed them and you look after them and you protect them, these slaves, but they are your property, right? So there is that connection, which is an easy connection. But it's much more like sort of an extreme or a more permanent employment than it is like the brutal, hard to imagine brutality of the more recent slavery. It was a commonplace, in fact, for a slave in the first century to be offered their freedom and for the slave to reject that offer, to deny it, and prefer to stay with that family under the care, under the protection of that master, of whoever it was. And we want Paul to come in and say, we've got to get rid of this social construct. We've got to get rid of the whole thing, right? No more of this thing that's part of, so grounded in the ancient world. But all the social reformers knew they couldn't simply say it like that, because if all of a sudden, I want you to think about the reality of what it would be. If all of a sudden slavery ended and you have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people out of work, unemployed, on the loose, that's very dangerous for the community, but it's also very dangerous for those people who were slaves. Again, this is how many of those people were socially, were physically, financially, were protected. This was their employment, the way they cared for their family, the way they put food on the table. And so getting rid of it, in many cases, wouldn't have freed them. It would have doomed them at least to homelessness, if not to worse. And so what we see Paul do instead is amazing and brilliant even, in that he insists that people be treated, that slaves be treated as fully human, with fully human rights, with full dignity and full value, responsibilities, and for Christians as brothers and sisters, equal with your own family. So that brings me to the second point. Okay, the first point is it's not that kind of slavery. And what Paul does, instead of getting rid of slavery, is say, here's how you should be treating these people, as if they are uh, since they are of absolute and equal value with you, which is the second point. The Bible is clear that all humans are equal. The Bible is clear that all humans are equal. Genesis 1:27 says Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, and the Bible is clear that all mankind came from Adam and Eve. There are no races in the Bible, right? We think of slavery and we think of it bound up with racism, but there are no races according to the biblical worldview. There's one race, the human race. That's it. Acts chapter 17, verse 26 says, God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. From one blood, that we are all one blood in physiological truth, not just Christological truth or theological truth. But we are one blood in Adam. There are no different races. So at the very nature, all people are of equal value, of equal status, of equal dignity. And Paul insisted this is the case. And so you should be treating these slaves as fully human, giving them full dignity and full responsibility. And that was just as revolutionary as anything else. I did a sermon recently on James chapter 2, 1 through 13, where the main message is showing no partiality. And that James insists that it is the role of the Christian, that the Christian can have no part in partiality. The Christian can have no part in showing partiality for any external reason, whether it be race or financial status or social status or whatever it is. That there's no room in Christianity for partiality of any kind. And that's the place that Paul is working from, that not getting rid of the social construct of slavery in the first century, as if he had the power to do that, but setting up, this is how it should work. Since it exists, here's how you should be treating these people. Here's how you should be acting in this system. Galatians, Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. Right? All are one in Christ and should be treated that way. And that's what Paul insists. The message of the gospel itself pushes back against anything that says we are of different value, that master and slave are of different value, that man and women, that whatever, are of different value, Jew or Greek, that all nations are under God and that God has been working from the beginning to make all nations his own. The fact that so many generations of Christians failed to see this and continued with such egregious sin, especially in America, doesn't mean the Bible isn't clear. It means there are some literacy issues, but more than that, it means that we must always be searching for our own presuppositions, for our own things that we're missing for our own convenience, for the sake of following God appropriately, of not misinterpreting God. Thirdly is the distinction between prescription and description. So just because Paul is describing the slave trade and saying things like, slaves, obey your masters in the Lord, for this is right, doesn't mean that Paul is prescribing this as a good thing. It just means he's describing this as the way that it was, and saying that since this is the way that it is, this is how you should act in that construct that exists socially. Instructing them to be good employees, just as he would instruct you to do today. Fourthly, it was Christians and the application of Christian biblical principles and the Christian biblical worldview that led to the demise of the slave trade. Highly recommend Eric Metaxas's book on William Wilberforce, the name of which I can't remember, but if you look up Metaxas and Wilberforce, you'll find it. Phenomenal biography of the man who, because of his Christianity, because of his love of God and his love of others, saw the egregiousness of what was going on in the slave trade and did all that he could to work to abolish it. Okay, so there's four things. Let me finish with quickly saying this. I won't go into it much because I talked about it a lot quite recently, in fact, oddly enough. It keeps coming up for some reason. But if you aren't a Christian, if you don't have God, believe in God, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to explain why slavery is wrong morally, or even why it's bad, right? Whichever word you want to say. The Christian has a logical and reasonable foundation from which to condemn slavery and to argue that slavery is wrong, and not just wrong, but illogical, right? Against the worldview, against our view of the world. But the one without God, and even particularly without the benevolent Christian God, struggles to have a grounding to say such things as slavery is wrong. Who's to say that it was wrong? Even if you try to argue that it's bad for humanity, so in that sense we herd morality to say that it's wrong. Who's to say it was bad for humanity? Bad for humanity in what way? And when we say it's bad for humanity or it didn't cause humans to prosper, again, whose definition of bad are we using? Whose definition of prosper are we using? How are we to know that it would be bad for humanity? It's very difficult to make the case that slavery is wrong if there is no Christian God, by the way. And very often, I say that because very often the people who are bringing this up are atheists who just want some kind of gotcha thing with the Bible, but they have a problem themselves when it comes to the wrongness, the morality of saying things like slavery is wrong. Because after all, if all we are is the strong surviving, if all we are is Darwinism, if just advanced animals, then all slavery is the prototype of that strong surviving. Um, who says it's wrong? The Grand says who, as we said before. But there's videos I'll post, try to link here that you can look back on or you can find on the channel pretty easily. Love you. Talk to you soon.